Hi, good evening everyone. My name is Efe, and welcome to the first international webinar hosted by AS Istanbul, also known as İTÜ Uçak Uzay Mühendisliği Kulübü in Turkish. Today we have a very special guest joining us all the way from Hawaii. So, as you might have guessed, it's a good morning instead of a good evening for him. Hi, Dr. Kelso. Good morning, and how are you?
I'm good, and aloha to you. How are you doing today?
I'm good too, thank you. Let's begin with getting to know you.
Okay. Well, so for those of you that don't know me, one of the main things I do is I run a website that's called Celestrac, and it's primarily focused on making sure that people have the data and the tools and the documentation to be able to track satellites in Earth orbit. And I've been doing that probably longer than most of you have been alive. So I've been doing that since 1985. And the other thing that I do, and is kind of an offshoot of what we've been doing on Celestrac, is I run something called the Space Data Center, where we are screening almost 800 satellites every day to try to keep them from running into each other and all the other junk that's up there in orbit.
So, how did you get interested in space?
That's actually a pretty easy one. So way back in the 1960s, I used to live in South Florida, and that was back when the U.S. was first doing their manned space missions, and they were doing that out of Cape Canaveral in Florida. And so, as you can imagine, there was a lot of interest and excitement going on with that program, but even more so in Florida. And so, watching those launches and seeing them in the newspaper every day really got me curious and interested about learning more about space.
I see. For our viewers who haven't heard of Celestrac before, could you explain what Celestrac is, what it does, and how people can benefit from it?
So, and this kind of goes back, and we'll probably talk about that in a little bit, but goes back to when I started this back in 1985. There wasn't any way there was software to figure out where a satellite would be, but the software doesn't do you any good if you don't have the data. And so Celestrac initially started because I realized that people didn't have easy access to the data. And so Celestrac initially was providing data on just a handful of satellites that people can go out and actually watch go overhead, and has now evolved, these many years later, into something where all satellites that we track up in Earth orbit and some others people are able to go in, find the data, know how to propagate it, so they can get accurate results, and then go off and do whatever it is that they want to do, whether it's navigation or amateur radio or just watching satellites like the space station go over and all those kinds of things. And so if you're working those kinds of issues, we have that data, and then of course I'm easily reachable via email, so that if you have questions, I'm more than happy to answer those questions. And we actually get something around 400,000 unique users on the site every day. So obviously we're doing something right.
Well, so how did you start Celestrac? I mean, it's not an easy task to track thousands of objects orbiting the Earth, after all.
Yeah, so that's kind of a more interesting story. So so many of you will have to go back to the history books to read this, but it's an important part of the whole journey, I guess. When I first started out doing this, was back when Skylab, which was one of the U.S. Manned space stations, was getting ready to re-enter. And so one night on the weatherman said, "Hey, if you go out tomorrow night and you look here, you'll see this dot of light going across the sky, and that's Skylab." And so I called one of my friends, and we went out in the backyard. And fortunately, often wonder what would have happened if it had been cloudy and I hadn't seen it. But we went out in the backyard, and sure enough, here's this dot of light, going across the sky. And that was when, so this was, I think this was like 1978. And so this was back when personal computers were first coming out too. And I was trying to do predictions of where the planets were going to be, just not because nobody had ever done it before, but because I wanted to learn more about how to do it and see how accurately I could do that. And when I saw Skylab go over, I thought, that's what I want to do. I want to know how to do that. And that really started the journey for how Celestrac got started, because there wasn't any internet to start with, right? So it wasn't like you could go out and Google, like, how do I track a satellite like you can today? And there really wasn't going to be much in a library. I mean, that would be the only place you could go. And so it was this kind of slow journey, and it ended up that I was getting a computer magazine, which was kind of the only way you get any news about the type of computer you were using. And one day there was an ad in there about some software to track satellites. And so I ended up getting the software and then trying to reverse engineer the software to figure out what it was doing. And I was in graduate school at the time, and our class leader was had worked in Cheyenne Mountains. That's where the U.S. used to do all their satellite tracking operations. And I asked him some questions about the code, and he said, "Oh, that's Sgp4." And my first reaction was, "Well, what the heck is that?" Which is probably what some of you are wondering. Is like, what is Sgp4? And it turns out it's the specific propagation algorithm, if you will, that's required to track the satellites with the type of data that the U.S. government had available. And so the next question was, well, where do I get the data? And it turned out back then, you actually so NASA was responsible for distributing the data, and you actually had to write them a letter and request the data. And then, maybe a couple of weeks later, you get a letter back and say, hey, we'll send you the data. And they would literally mail me a packet, first class mail. They would mail me a packet with, just a couple of sheets of paper, and one for each satellite, that had just 2 lines on it. So for those of you that are familiar, the data is in a compressed format. It only takes 2 lines, and that's because we didn't have lots of bandwidth or connectivity back then to transmit it. So they would send me a piece of paper, and then I would sit there and type up the numbers and then try to see if I could see the satellites. And so, there wasn't really this connectivity. And then at the time, by the time I got to doing that, I was in Silicon Valley, so down in Mountain View, not far from where Apple is located right now. And I was working with some people in the community that were trying to set up electronic bulletin boards, basically. So if you're not familiar with the concept, you had a computer, and you would install the software on your computer, and then you would hook it up to a modem, and then people could call into your home phone number, and they would connect to the modem, and they'd connect to the computer, and you could read messages or some other things. And my thought was like, hey, I'm sitting there typing this stuff up every day. What if I typed it up and put it on the bulletin board, and then people that wanted to track satellites would come in and just get it and not have to type it up and maybe make errors and everything. Not that there was actually likely to be a whole lot of people on the planet at the time that wanted to do that, but somehow that seemed like an obvious thing to do. And it turned out it was. It wasn't immediate, but surprisingly, even without any way to communicate easily between people, because you didn't have email access, you didn't have any of the web stuff, it was pretty difficult to do a global type of interchange. And so once that was in place, then by word of mouth, it just kind of grew. And of course, I was in U.S. Air Force, and I tended to move around. And the downside of that was, oh yeah, well, when you move from, so I was in California, and then I went to Texas. It's like, oh well, when you move, you're going to get a new phone number, and everybody has to figure out what your new phone number is somehow. And I ended up telling people that I'm going to move. If you want to know what the new phone number is, let me know, and I'll send you a postcard with with the new phone number when I get. And so it started out that way, and eventually went on the internet. But that the whole concept initially was just, how do you get this data from NASA out to other people in the community that might want to use it?
That's how it all started then.
Right.
Now let's get into some details. Say we have launched a human-made object to low Earth orbit. How does Celestrac get to know about it?
So talking about like, how do we know when something first gets launched? Yeah. Okay.
More like
right. So today we have so we set up Celestrac, or I set up Celestrac back in, actually it's probably a little earlier than 1985, but by 1985 it was fully up and running. And I got into this process, with NASA, requesting more and more data. And when one day I sent them a request, and they wrote me back and they said, well, we have a limit of 25 satellites, and so we can't give you any more data. And so then I wrote them back and I said, hey, there's a lot of people dialing into my bulletin board, and they're getting this data, so it saves you from having to answer mail from them and make copies and mail it out to them and all this stuff. So, maybe we could get an exception here. And the next thing I knew, they were sending this, stack of just 2-line element data, as if I had time to type all that up. But over the years, so it took probably 8 years of working with NASA, trying to encourage them. It's like, well, why don't you set up a bulletin board, and then we won't have to do this. So that took about 8 years, and then eventually they went on the internet probably a couple of years after that. And then right about just under 20 years ago, the Air Force decided, really because NASA didn't want to do it anymore. The U.S. Air Force was generating the data, and it's like they got approval to generate or to distribute it themselves. And so they set up something called Spacetrac. And so we work pretty closely with them. I mean, we offered to the Air Force that we would do it for them and not charge them. And they didn't seem to like that idea for some reason. So they set up Spacetrac, and we work with them. And so Spacetrac gets their data directly from now the U.S. Space Force, and we get our data from them. And so, but there are, even though we pointed out some of the issues to Spacetrac, we have issues that normally you would expect to see something in what we call the satellite catalog. It's kind of a database of, I'll say, metadata that describes, the name of the satellite and its catalog number and some other information, like when it was launched or if it's decayed, things like that. And you would normally think that if a new object launched, the first thing you would see would be something in the SatCat, and then you would go from there. But what we get is we get the orbital data, and we don't have any idea what it is. And so we have a process that regularly checks to pull that data in, and then I get a notification, usually on my watch, that says, hey, there's new data, you need to do something. And I go out, and usually it's fairly simple. We're keeping track of when satellites are supposed to launch, and so if you see one and you look at the orbital parameters, and it's like, oh, it looks like that might be that launch. You do that. Now we get launches out of particularly China, where they don't announce or pre-announce a lot of their launches, and all you can do is go out on their news site and find some kind of a story, usually in a couple hours after the launch. But we take that information, and then we update our satellite catalog, our SatCat, on Celestrac, and make sure the data's out there, and it goes into the different files that are set up to be able to do that. And so that's for not just for low Earth orbit, but for any orbit around the Earth. So LEO, low Earth orbit, geosynchronous Earth orbit, anything in between.
Okay. So Celestrac got its data from Spacetrac. Does it do anything to process that data? And if it does, how does it do that?
We do. I mean, and I don't mean this in a disparaging way, but it seems that we run into issues with some of the data that we get out of Spacetrac. So one of the first things we do, and one of the things that we've always done with the data on Celestrac, is to try to very rigorously check it so that it's not going to cause problems for people that are using it. And if you think about it from the perspective, I'll give you an example. So I mentioned we have about 400,000 people a day accessing the site, and one of the files, the file with the space station in it, gets downloaded 1 million times a day. So there's obviously people going in there and downloading it more than once a day. Not that they would need to, but they do. And so if you think about it from the perspective of, well, if there's something wrong in that data, and then they try to use it, it's going to cause problems for a lot of people. And so Celestrac's always operated from the perspective of, we take the data, and it's not just from Spacetrac. We get data on the orientation of the Earth. We get data about space weather. We get GPS data. They all come from different organizations. And so we go through a process of rigorously testing all the data to make sure that and right isn't the right word. I mean, sometimes the data can look okay and work okay, but there's some other kind of issue, and that's a more complicated part of it. But want to make sure that it's not going to break people's software. And so the notion has always been, hey, we've got a process. It's going to do all this stuff. If it works, it'll put the data out on Celestrac. If it doesn't work, it just stops. And then I get a notification that says, hey, there's a failure here. You need to fix it. And the notion is we're not propagating problems for the entire community. The data will stop updating. It's not like you can't use it. And then we'll figure it out and fix it. And then so we do that once, and you don't have potentially thousands or even hundreds of thousands of people out there trying to figure out what's going on and why things aren't working. And so we do that, and then we do a lot of other things to curate the data into forms that make it more easily usable. And so one of those is, and this was driven back in the early days by not having the kind of bandwidth we have today, is that we have individual sets. So if somebody is just interested in amateur radio, where it might be a few hundred satellites, they don't really need a data set that has 20,000 objects in it, where most of them aren't operational satellites. You couldn't communicate with them anyway. And so we have things like that. We do that for Earth resources. We do it for weather. We do it for special customers, like there are search and rescue satellites that are used by various countries around the world, and they come to Celestrac to get just the small set of data that has those operational satellites in it, so that when they're doing their search and rescue missions, they know, which satellites they can use, and then, what their positions are, so they can help find people. So it's really kind of an interesting process as you go through it, and particularly as you see who's using it and what they're using it for. I mean, things that the notion was always, we're going to do the upfront part. So we'll get the data, we'll make sure that you have the software to propagate the data. In other words, predict where the satellite is going to be over time. And then you have something you want to do that is more than that. So you want to, communicate, or you want to do search and rescue, whatever it happens to be. And so that's kind of what we're doing. And the whole focus is to make sure that when people are doing that they can depend on the part that we're providing to the community.
So there are things being done in the background that we cannot see.
Yeah.
My next question is going to be, does Celestrac include all the human-made objects in orbit, or are there exceptions to that?
Yeah, that's, I'll say it's an interesting question, and it's a lot more complicated than people think. And so, to start with, you have to realize that when we track satellites, you have to somehow be able to sense them. So you might think, oh, I go outside and I see this dot of light going across the sky, and it's like, well, that's a satellite. And so if I have an optical sensor, telescope, I can get observations on that object as it's moving, and then process those into an orbit and then predict where it's going to go. And you can do the same thing with radars or whatever. But all of those systems have some kind of limitation, right? So if you're using a telescope, for example, something that's big and bright will be easy to see. Something that's small, like a Cubesat, might not be easy to see. And so there's going to be limitations on what you can track, and CubeSats are a good example. Well, I'll tell you a little bit of the history on CubeSat. So back many years ago, because the CubeSat guys have been at this probably for 30 years now too, they're trying to figure out what is the right size that we should aim for to try to make a satellite. And the idea was, let's make it small, presumably so that it would be less expensive and easier to get to orbit. Because at the time, even today, cost probably $10,000 a pound just to get something into orbit. And so, if you have 1 pound satellite, that's not too bad. But if you have a 100-pound satellite, maybe that's not so good. And so they were trying to reduce the size. And of course, you don't want to go as small as you can possibly make it. One of the questions was, well, how small can we make it and still have it be trackable? And unfortunately, the US military was less than transparent on asking that question. And they had a standard answer, which was that the radars tracked objects that were 10 centimeters or larger in low Earth orbit. And they really didn't provide they weren't willing to provide more detailed information. And so the community just assumed that meant that they could. So really what they were being told was they can see something that's 10 centimeters or larger. That doesn't really mean you can track something that's 10 centimeters or larger, because to do that, that means, well, I saw it at this time, and then the next time I saw it, I knew what it was, and I put it in the same orbit, and then the next time, and the next time. And so that I got this continuing set of observations that I can process into an orbit. And so if you only see it occasionally because the geometry with the radar is such that you can't see it, or like today, where we get dozens, or even we've had as many as 100 CubeSats get launched at a time, trying to figure out, well, I see a dot, but I don't know if that's the same dot I saw last time, or it's one of the other 100 satellites from that launch. And so you get to a point where there are things that can be seen, but they can't be tracked, or they can't easily be tracked or reliably be tracked. And so for the most part, we're talking about things down to 10 centimeters is the smallest. But if you look at reports out of NASA or ESA or some of the other organizations that are working debris, we know that, so for 10 centimeters, you're looking at, around 26,000 objects. Now, you might remember that I said, 21 or so thousand that we're getting today. And I'll talk a bit about that in just a minute. But so for something like this, you've got about 25,000. When you go down to, and you say, well, something in LEO that might be traveling at 7.5 kilometers a second, and say it's coming towards something else that's doing the same thing, you could have an object that's moving at 14, 15 kilometers a second. And so, something like that could do serious damage, right? And if you think about it, a good way to think about it is I would do presentations and try to get people to understand, well, why do we care about debris? And it's like, well, if I had a bullet and I threw it at you, and I actually hit you, that'd be the first part. If I threw the bullet at you and I hit you, you might go, ow, what the heck are you doing? But we all know if you put it in a rifle and do that, it's going to do a lot more damage. It's not just going to annoy you. And it's not because of the size of the mass, it's because of the energy. And so the energy goes up as a square of the velocity. And so when you think about it, a high power rifle bullet goes about 1 kilometer a second. So if you're talking about, now I'm going to take the same thing, except now it's going 15 kilometers a second, that means it's got, over 200 times as much energy as it would be coming out of that rifle. And so when you're looking at these other objects, you think, wow, we might want to be able to track them, or we can't track them. And the estimate, I think NASA and ESA are pretty close together on that. They estimate something on the order of like 700,000 objects just from 1 centimeter and up. And so, the first thing is, yeah, we can't track all of it just because there's limits on the sensors. And then there's limits on the processing that we see too. And so, and if we have time and there's interest, I can show you some of this on Celestrac. But so we get, I think today we're getting something like 21,000 element sets, data on individual objects that are being tracked in Earth orbit. And we estimate there's probably like another 6,000 that are being tracked, occasionally or whatever, but that the U.S. Space Force can't figure out what they are, or they don't have a really good orbit because they're not getting good enough tracking on it. And so, you sit there and say, well, you told me it was 21,000, and now you're telling me it's, 26, 27,000. What is it? And it's like, well, it depends on how you define that. So so all we're saying is down to, around the limits of what the sensors that are being used today are, like, so down to about 10 centimeters, that we can reliably track about 21,000 objects. And then below that, there's going to be some things that'll be smaller than that. And of course, if you're further out in orbit, then it's got to be bigger to be able to see and track reliably. But when you get down to that level, you can go a little bit below that, and you'll occasionally see things that aren't something else, but you can't track them reliably to be able to maintain it. You can't figure out what launch they came from. And so you end up in this situation where there's a lot of stuff that you can't track reliably, and that's in that And in the Space Force, they call it their Analyst Satellites. So they have a separate catalog that just allows them to try to keep track of these objects. And if they ever figure out what it is and they get a good orbit on it, then it goes into the public catalog. But then if you're talking about, well, what is up there that could do damage to another satellite or a human, right? If you have people on the space station, for example, the numbers are much, much higher. So yeah, there's lots of exceptions there, and we try to at least work to make sure that the stuff that is reliably tracked is out there, and if there are issues with that, and we do find and report issues from time to time, that we try to get that fixed for everybody in the community to be able to use.
Apart from the hardware limitations, are there any governmental or bureaucratic restrictions on putting those objects in the website?
Yeah, so this is actually one of the, to be perfectly honest, I think it's kind of silly, but we go through this mode, and the U.S. did this for a long, long time, right? So they would launch reconnaissance or surveillance satellites, military satellites, and they didn't want to tell. Well, they particularly didn't want to tell countries like Russia where their satellites were, and the reality is Russia knows where those satellites are. And so we're in this game of, some people have convinced leadership in the U.S. that if we don't tell them, somehow they won't know where they are. And if you do any searching around on the internet, you'll find out that there's groups of amateurs that are able to. They do really a pretty amazing job of just collecting observations and figuring out how to process them into orbit and track things that the U.S. government clearly thinks they can't track. And so anybody that's reasonably logical would have to assume that if a bunch of, it's not like it's an organization, it's just a bunch of people working together essentially over email. And to think that, some major government like Russia, for example, couldn't pull together the resources to be able to do that seems a bit naive. So, the U.S. has taken the position over many years of not releasing data on their operational military or intelligence satellites. They've also, this goes back probably 10 or more years now, but then they started doing the same thing for some of their allies. So, European countries or whatever, and that didn't want to share that information. But of course, they publish that information for Russia. And one of the things I had the opportunity to do while I was still in the Air Force was I was leading the U.S. side of our, I guess we were just trying to work together to kind of share things to make space a little bit safer, right? To help, how we track. And part of the arrangement was, well, we're going to, the U.S. will give Russia their catalog of objects, and Russia will do the same thing for the U.S. Well, of course, Russia gave us their catalog, and it had all of their classified satellites in it, and of course, all of our classified satellites in it as well. And then the U.S. gave it back, and it only had the Russian classified satellites. And so you can imagine, after a while, the Russians just said, "Yeah, we're not really interested in doing this. You're not living up to the arrangement." But so there are things like that countries don't release, and the reality is, at least from being in the U.S., my perspective is you're not really keeping it from Russia or China or whoever the U.S. thinks the bad guys are. You're just keeping it from the American taxpayer. I mean, so it's not like if you don't want to know where it is that you can't figure out where it is. But yeah, we do that, and Celestrac doesn't get in the middle of that. I mean, we're at least not right now. So since we're getting the data from the U.S. government, and they don't give us the data for those satellites, we don't have a way to provide that. Now, we have made a little bit of headway in the last couple of years, where we were able to finally get some of the people that make these kinds of decisions to understand that you're really not protecting anything. If you're making decisions under the assumption that these objects can't be tracked because you don't tell anybody where they are, then you're probably making bad decisions. And they started releasing some of them in the interest of safety of flight, because that's really our concern. So if you have two satellites up in orbit and this one is yours, and you don't know this other one is over here, there's all sorts of potential to do the wrong thing. And that's what we're trying to get. We're not asking for tell us what the satellite does or anything else. Just, please help us to make sure that, we know where these are, and we can effectively stay out of your way if that's, the way we have to operate. But you don't want one satellite to think, oh, I know exactly what they're going to do. And then this satellite, for some reason, they've never done it before, but now it's like, oh, I'm going to do this. And then the next thing you know, you have, a collision, say in GEO or whatever. So we're trying to affect that. But yeah, there are limitations for, I guess, national security or perceived national security reasons that the US and some other countries don't release certain types of data.
Politics is really interesting.
Yeah, it is.
What happens if an object cannot be identified? Is there a classification for that kind of objects?
That's causing it's causing some problems, because the community is kind of set up to understand that there's a SATCAT entry that describes what the satellite is and who's responsible for it, things like that. And the problem that we have, and this is probably more of an administrative issue, but back in the early days when the U.S. Air Force was doing this, they didn't put the things that they couldn't identify into the public catalog, because you didn't have some of the information. You couldn't say, well, here's the international designator, which is an international catalog number, if you will, that helps people know where, what launch it was from, and things like that. And you didn't know when it was launched. You don't know who owns it. And so it's like, I have this database and I can't fill in the fields for the database, so I'll just have a separate database that doesn't require that. And so we're at a point now where it's like, yeah, we don't really need to know that. I mean, if it's just a piece of something, small, and you don't know who it belongs to, that doesn't mean it can't hit another satellite. And so just, tell us. And so the US has released some of those. So I mentioned there's about 6,000 in their catalog. They released almost 500. And so that helps. And now they've got a new sensor called the Space Fence that's supposed to significantly increase things. We've only seen, to this point, probably a couple of hundred objects, but you get into this mode where there's these other objects, and we're trying to figure out how to make it easy for people to access. And so there's this other complication. So for those of you that aren't familiar with some of the development of the data formats, and you might have run into it in other cases, like we still see people using 2-digit years. Even after, the year 2000, we still have people using 2-digit years for things. And it's like, you didn't learn anything from that. And so when the 2-line element set format was created, the idea was put as much data into two, and really it was 2 computer cards. So for those of you that might know what a computer card is, you had to type in, numbers in this case on a card, and it would punch holes to kind of decode what the number was for the computer. So you could read it at the top, and then there are a bunch of holes in the bottom for the card reader to be able to figure out what it was and translate it for the computer. And so they use 2-digit years and some other things. And one of the limitations was they said, well, we're only going to use 5 digits for the catalog number, which back in the 1970s, when they did that, the thought that we would go over 100,000 objects in Earth orbit was probably reasonably unforeseeable. And, but today we're coming up on 50,000 objects in Earth orbit. And you might think, well, that means we've still got another 50,000. Well, because those analyst satellites, remember I told you there were like 6,000 of those, and they don't keep a catalog number. So you might get assigned a number at some point, and you'll keep that because you know what it is. But if they're tracking some object and they assign a temporary catalog number, it might get reassigned, or they might need more at some times and less at other times. And so they've actually blocked off from 70,000 to 100,000 for that analyst catalog. So that means we only have 20,000 more before we run out of catalog numbers. And so then the next thing that you run into is, well, so if you go over that, what do you do? Well, you can't do anything. Well, there's a proposal to do something to cram, extra stuff in using letters instead of numbers, but that probably creates more problems than it solves. Anyway, you get into having to modify all sorts of existing software that expects to be able to do this. So the new space fence objects that we're getting actually have a 6-digit catalog number. So it means you can't use the old format, or you can't use the old format the way it's designed to be used, and you have to change all sorts of other things. So there's and a lot of you are probably sitting there going, what is he talking about? but these are all holdovers to limitations from decades ago that haven't been changed yet. And so Celestrac is working on that. And when we get to looking at the site briefly, I'll show you where you can find out more information about that. But that's actually a very difficult issue, because from a safety of flight perspective, you want to know where as much of the things that could potentially cause damage to a satellite or people or whatever, where they are, and be able to predict where they're going to be. And as it turns out in most things, right, making that happen requires getting down in the weeds and going, oh, well, how do I track more than 100,000 objects when I only have 100,000 digit numbers? And so it seems trivial, but it's actually very fundamental. And the concern that we have, and we've been working on this for almost a year now, the concern we have is that people won't realize it's a problem until there's a problem, right? So it's like, oh, well, we're tracking everything and we're fine. And then they finally go over the limit where we go to something that was just launched that has a catalog number over 100,000. And it's like, oh, I can't track this because my software doesn't know, what to do with it, right? It's not in the right format or something else. And so I've actually spent a lot of the last year just going through the stuff for Celestrac and the Space Data Center, trying to make those adjustments. You would be amazed at how many places that kind of stuff gets buried in your code. And so if you wait until it's a problem, you're basically not going to be able to do anything, because you can't just magically wave your hands over the code and have it say, oh, well, now now this number means something different than what I told you it meant before, because it's likely not going to be in just one place. And so, it's kind of a longer answer to your question, but there's a lot of other moving parts here that affect that. And as you all know, we're seeing lots more launches today. And I think we're going to talk a little bit more about that when we get into the space traffic management part.
Exactly. While answering the previous questions, you mentioned of the TLEs, two-line element sets. When you get the data, how do you decide if those TLEs are unhealthy? Can you do anything to refine or edit those data?
We don't change the data. And so, I mean, it's a good question, right? So we get like a common problem that we see, and it's easiest to see looking at data for, say, geosynchronous satellites, just because of the way they're trying to stay at a fixed position relative to the Earth. That we can tell if all of a sudden it's like, oh, it shows a maneuver when it didn't maneuver, or vice versa. And so what we see is satellite does a maneuver, and then the data that is coming out. And so this is in the Space Data Center where we're getting the data directly from the operator. We'll see they show that they did a maneuver, and then it takes the guys on the U.S. Space Force side a day or two to figure out, oh, there's a maneuver, what's the new orbit, and then publish the data. And so that's probably the most common problem that we have. But we don't go in, like we don't have the authority to take the data out of the Space Data Center and put it in. But a lot of operators, including some of the ones that are in the Space Data Center, have released or do release their data on the internet. Now, the problem there tends to be that they have their own custom format, and it's not just the format and the units. It's things like, well, what's the coordinate frame and how do I propagate it? Because how you predict where a satellite's going to be depends on the forces that are acting on the satellite. And so, I'm assuming you've all had some basic astrodynamics, where you do Kepler's law and all that kind of stuff, and you go, oh, well, it's falling under gravity, and I just do this prediction, and then I get where it is. Well, if it's in Leo, there's also drag, right? And so if you do that prediction using the stuff that Newton came up with no drag, you're going to find out that it doesn't propagate very well. And so depending on which model you use is going to depend on, or is going to affect how well you can predict where the satellite's going to be. And so basically what we do is we take the data from these operators and the model that they're using and all of that, and we translate's really not the right word, but we take that data and we ingest it, and then use the same process that you would with Sgp4, that propagator for the two-line element sets, to fit a two-line element set based on that data. And it turns out it's very much more accurate. So if you get into a situation where, oh, there's a satellite, and so this is only obviously going to work for active satellites that you're collecting data on. But if you have a satellite that maneuvered, and the data that's coming out from the U.S. government, because it's tracking stuff in the past, it's not they're doing something wrong. It's just you can't predict where it's going to be tomorrow if you're looking at where it was yesterday and there's a maneuver. So, what we do is we fit those predictions from the operator that have the maneuvers in them. And so we can kind of look ahead for where it's going to be. And so what we do is we actually have, so there's like 4,000 active satellites in Earth orbit now. And of those, about 1,500 to 2,000 of them, we have these types of TLEs, and we call them supplemental TLEs. They're based on independent data from the operator. We have supplemental TLEs or sub TLEs for 1,500 to 2,000 of them. So if you have a satellite that is like, oh, I thought it was going to be here, and now I can't hear from it, because like if you're in geo and you're doing communications and you point your antenna and all of a sudden I don't have a signal, it's like, well, maybe the satellite moved, right? And so I don't want to move my antenna until I know where it moved to. Well, if we have that supplemental data, we know where it is, and you can use that instead of, the normal data. So we're not yet to the point where we're showing the discrepancy between those two sets. We're working towards doing that, but ultimately we will do that on Celestrac. But in the meantime, if you want, and if you're really doing those kinds of things, I can help you make that pretty easy. We actually have a really short query you can do that says, essentially, is there any supplemental data for this object? And if there is, you get it, and if not, it tells you that there isn't, and you can do that. And so we help a lot of people with that. And in fact, we've helped the Space Force guys recently, because they would lose some of the Indian navigation satellites for some reason. I mean, they must have been doing some kind of maneuver, and for whatever reason, just probably because of limited sensor coverage over that part of the world, they weren't seeing the changes right away, and then it would take days and days before they could figure out where it was. And it's like, hey, those satellites are tracked with laser ranging, and ISRO, the Indian Space Organization, is able to process that data and generate predictions, and we use those predictions and we generate supplemental TLEs. So when you can't find it, you can use this query and you can see if there's any data, and the data is probably current because they're tracking with lasers every day, because it's a navigation system. They need to know exactly, where these satellites are, and so they can use that to correct it, and anybody can use it. So we don't edit it, but we're trying to make it, we don't yet make it easy to see when they don't match. We're working on that. But if you're not sure, the first thing to do is to check the supplemental data and use that instead.
So before drowning you in more questions, it would be great if we could have some time to share the screen and show us the features in Celestrac. I mean, those
Sure.
visualization tools are really great, and I want everyone to see them.
Yeah, we don't want to run out of time. I don't know what everybody's schedule is. Let's do this, share. Okay. So for those of you that haven't been there, this is Celestrac, and I'll talk a little bit about the layout. I often over the years get this comment about, we use a lot of tables like this, where they have the alternating light blue, dark blue, and or darker blue, and people go, well, that's kind of old school layout for your site. And it's like, well, it's intended to be. So we talked initially about how Celestrac came to be, and it was back in the days when we used to feed cards into card readers and we'd get printouts. There wasn't a screen that you could look at, and the printouts were this alternating white and blue. And so it's kind of a kickback to what we're doing. But I mentioned just a little while ago about what we're doing with the 5-digit catalog numbers, and we've got it right up at the top of the site to give you the information about how you can do that. And we're hoping that at least software developers go and do that. But if you go into that page, you find out it's like, well, here's the type of data that we get today. A 2-line element set, or it's really a 3-line, because when I first started putting this out electronically, we put the name on top of the 2 lines of data. But if you click the format you want, and then if you say, well, show me, the objects that have launched in the last 30 days, you get, for most of you are probably sitting there going, what the heck is all of that? And that's kind of what we're trying to get away from. This is just a particular format, for that data. And this is, you can see that it's in this fixed layout. So, here's the 5-digit catalog number that we were talking about. And there really isn't space to put other things in there. And so the goal was, well, how do we fix that? And so that's 3-line. That's you can do the same thing with 2-line. It's intended to be really easy to change to these different formats, but there are international standards for the formats. And if you're familiar with something like JSON, you can go in, you can get the data as JSON data. The whole thing is intended to be really, really easy. And then you can even do something like comma delimited to be able to get the data. And so you can load that in a spreadsheet and do a lot of stuff. And one of the things I should point out is that we've gone from the 2-line stuff that we've gone from the 2-line stuff that has a 2-digit year and a day of the year and then a fraction of a day, which is hard for most people to wrap their heads around and isn't Y2K compliant. We've actually used the international standard date time format, for all of those kinds of things. And there's an article that talks about, what's the problem, what's the solution, what did we do, and it's a surprisingly short article for what might be considered a complicated topic. And so if we go back to the main page, the one thing beyond that you might notice is we have this orbit visualization. If you haven't played with this is really cool. So I spent a lot of time just putting data out that people could get to and use, but what it required was, you get all these numbers and then you have to find some software to go with it. And then you have to make sure that the software can do something else with it. And I have to make sure I get the right data. And it tends to be more complicated than it should be. And it's like, well, let's just roll this all up using modern web technology into something that you can use on any computer, not just Windows or requiring something unique. And so if you click on the link, what it's going to do, and I encourage you to try this on your own at home, because it when we're video streaming, it won't be as smooth as it will be on your system. But we just, in the couple of seconds that I was talking, we loaded a globe and all 21,000 objects that are currently in Earth orbit. And it's not just a picture. It's, you can interact with it. In fact, I'll show you, you can see things like these strings of objects here. So all the stuff that's green, whether it's back here in the back or, up here, all those are active satellites. And it turns out these are, whoops, I clicked on the wrong one. Get rid of that. If you click on, any of these, you'll see, oh yeah, they're Starlink satellites. And so just, in the last month or two, each one of these strings is 60 satellites. And so they're launching pretty quickly, and you can go in and you can animate. I don't know how choppy this will be as I'm animating it, but you can really speed it up. The one thing we didn't do is we didn't turn on daylight, but so you can see, what parts of the Earth are in daylight. As you're going around, you can see everything out to the geo belt. So I said green are active satellites, orange are dead satellites, and then red are rocket bodies, and then the gray are debris. And the gray is a little bit harder to see, especially when they're moving like that, but you get the sense that there's a lot there. And if you wanted to do something like, to see, what parts of this population are different types of satellites, you can click on a little satellite icon. It brings up that SatCat we were talking about. that has all the metadata, and you can say, well, show me the active satellites. And if you do that, I mean, you don't even have to hit enter. It shows you, here's all the active satellites. And if you say, well, okay, and you'll notice I mentioned earlier that there's 4,000 of them. That's this number down here in the bottom. And so now if we say, well, but how many dead satellites are there still in orbit? Because we don't leave a lot of those up there, right? And it turns out that there's 2,700 dead satellites up in Earth orbit, and they're in all different orbital regimes. And you can do the same thing for rocket body. So you can just type rocket body. There's actually one satellite that has rocket in its name, so I type out the whole thing. But you can see that there's 2,000 rocket bodies. So it helps people to understand, yeah, this is a problem, and we really have to start working on what the problem is. And so, that's there. There's, I'll show you as we quickly go through some of the other stuff, but what most people are interested in is the current data. If you go into the current data, instead of having that full catalog, you now have these separate lists. And so this is the old one with everything is just 3-line element sets essentially. But you can do things in here where you can go into a table and you can see the orbital data presented in a way that might be useful. And so, like if you were interested in, say, this particular launch, and this is the international designator, you can copy that up here. And instead of getting everything, instead of getting all 232 objects that were launched in the last 32 days, you only get the 64, so it's 64 satellites and then 4 pieces of debris. And you can, sort the data so you can see it's like, oh, well, this one is old and it's probably because, the apogee and perigee is low. It's either already decayed and it's not showing as decayed, or it's getting ready to decay and they're not tracking it reliably. So there's lots of different information there. And you can do the same thing here if you click on the globe and you just want to see what was launched in the last 30 days. And since there's so many of them, it's a little bit more difficult. But if we go through like all the pages and we're working to, typically you don't want to do this because it just slows things down. But when you start adding everything in there, you start realizing it's like, wow, there's a lot of stuff we've launched into Earth orbit. And usually there's stuff out in geo or geosynchronous transfer orbit, but you can see where all of the individual satellites are in there. And
could you search for ITU PSAT-1? That's our school's first satellite.
Oh, okay. Well, let me. So we want to go back to. Yeah, we just for that one. So did you just launch it or?
No, it's been launched in 2009. It's in the visualization tool as far as I know. It would be interesting to see it.
So there's a couple ways you could do that. So here's our SatCat, right? So if you go up and you say search the SatCat, and so if we put ITU,
and oh, okay.
Well, we just need part of the name.
Oh, okay, great.
And if you know it's a payload, you can leave it checked. I mean, you can sit there and limit it to payloads or limit it to active and hit submit. Then it's going to give you those. So this is the one you're talking about. And if you wanted to see, well, what's the data for that satellite? There's the data. And okay. And if you wanted to see, well, what other objects were launched at the same time that are still in Earth orbit, you can see that. And so if you wanted to do something like, well, I want to see all those objects, you can see like all of the objects from that launch, or you can see just the object that you're interested in just by clicking on the appropriate globe. And then, in a matter of seconds, boom, there's the globe, there's the satellite. And if you want to see real time, which it should have been real time, it looks like it's over Spain right now. And so it's intended to be really, really simple now to get in and answer questions like that. And we're working on tools so you could say, well, I want to know when it's going to be over, like Istanbul. And so, you would have your location in there, and then you could actually, generate a pass schedule automatically. We have a prototype tool that does that, but I'm not really happy with the interface, and we're in the process of redesigning it. But it's really, really simple. You don't have to know. It's like, well, what's a 2-line element set? Where do I get them? What's the one? What's the latest one that I have that I want to be sure I'm using? What software do I put it into? Does it run on my operating system? I mean, this tool will run on Windows, it'll run on Mac, it'll run on Linux, it'll run on iOS, it'll run on Android. I mean, you can literally pull these pages up on your phone, your smartphone, and you should be able to, have that view of whatever it is you're looking for. So it's really easy to find. And then we even have search buttons where you can go in and you can quickly do, whatever your search engine is set up for to look for that particular satellite. And so you can find like the Wikipedia entry for that satellite. So that's gives you a sense for how we're trying to make this stuff like really easy to get to. And so one of the other things I wanted to show you though on the current data page, since we were talking about earlier, is we have what now is called the master 2-line element set index. And it has a variety of the types of data that we use to track what's going on. And so some of it is, well, how old is the data for today? This is the latest data. And then what is the history over time? And you can see it's like, oh, we had this problem, for days where the data didn't update. And sometimes people will ask me, it's like, well, do you know that, your data is not updating? It's like, yes, I'm very well aware. I've notified, the Space Force and the Celestrac guys of that. But, through a nice, easy interface, where you can see, all the data over years and years of doing operations for Celestrac. And you can see how the number of objects, so this is from 2016, we were down at just over 15,000 objects. And now in 2021, we're up to over 20,000 objects. So we've gone up 5,000 objects in Earth orbit, not all payloads, but payloads and rocket bodies and debris and that kind of stuff over time. And you can see, we were talking about lost satellites. You can see those numbers down here. You can see we had a problem back around the early part of the year. It apparently occurred because they weren't doing some of the work that they would normally do over the holidays that we have at the end of the year. And so they lost like about 500 satellites that they hadn't tracked it for more than 30 days. And so, we got data on that. You've got, whoops, I'm sorry, didn't mean to go back there. If you wanted to see, well, what satellites have recently decayed, we've got that. If you're interested in lost satellites, so there's actually, we talked about the analyst catalog and not knowing what something is and whether you can track it or not. These are actually things that they know what they are, but they haven't been able to track them for the last 30 days, and they're not updating the data. And surprisingly, there are a lot of those. So we're currently tracking about 1,400 objects there, which means, if we don't have data for it, we can't predict whether it's a problem for safety of flight. And out of that, that's probably the main thing that you would be interested in. And so, we've got that. I should mention there's a couple of tutorials that are out there on YouTube about like the visualization tool. We've got historical data, where you can go in and you can actually just submit a request and say, well, I need, here's my name, here's my address, these are the objects I want data for this time period, and then we'll email you the data. So if you're doing research or something, we got columns that I wrote back in, I guess, like the mid to late 90s on different subjects about tracking satellites and tracking, things like the sun and the moon and geostationary orbits or whatever. These, surprisingly, I mean, you can see, we've had over 400,000 accesses to this page. So a lot of people are finding that of use. And then I think, the next topic you wanted to get into was on the conjunction, or the safety of flight stuff. And we'll talk about that then. But we have GPS data. And the one thing I really didn't show you was I said, well, this is current data. This is the data that we get from via Celestrac. There's the supplemental data is here. And it's kind of laid out the same way, in different sets, because we get data for Starlink and Planet and OneWeb and GPS and GLONASS, Meteosat. I mean, they all have their own individual ways of producing the data, and you can with these little eyes here. This is that prototype pass scheduler I was talking about. You can go in and get a pass schedule. It's not easy to do with a lot of satellites is a problem. So I'll ask you, like, where are you located? You can just tell it, use my current position, surprisingly, and you may not be aware of it, but apparently your browser knows exactly where you are. For some reason, that's not working today on Google. All right, well, anyway, normally you just like click that. It must have a hidden, must be asking for something. I don't see it on the screen, but whoops. But normally you just click use current position and your browser may ask you to confirm that or something. And then you can go in and you can say, I want to see the visible passes for a satellite. And unfortunately, this is one of the things I don't like is if there aren't any, get this like really brief notice that says there's nothing, and then it goes back. If you pick all passes, you get the idea, and then you can click on one of the passes. Whoops. No, well, I guess because we don't have we're not able to set the location for some reason.
It might be something to do with having multiple browsers open, maybe, if the Chrome is using your position.
Yeah, data. I think there's something else going on. But I just use the pick it with the map, and so if we did visible, like if there once it's done the calculations, it's probably there we go. So you can see, you can jump to the start of a pass. You can go to the middle of the pass. You can, just like you were doing before, except you're doing it from your observer location. And in fact, if you go to the home position, you can even see, where that position is on the map. All the way, usually all the way down to, like the street level. So, I mean, it gives you a sense. And so if you needed to move it, you could move it. But I mean, for something like this, if your house was over here, it's not going to make much difference. And then there's the next pass, for that satellite over that location. So, it goes through that kind of mode, but we're trying to get that working where it's more intuitive. I don't think it's to the point where many people would. I would want to, with 400,000 users a day, I want to put out things that aren't going to generate a lot of questions that I have to spend all day answering. It's like they should be pretty easy to explain, and you should be able to, answer a question pretty quickly. Like I'll do stuff out on Twitter, and my objective is if I can't explain it to you in a single Twitter message, then it's too complicated. And so if I say, oh, you go to the Celestrac homepage and you click on launch orbit visualization, and then you're into it, I can do that pretty easily in a tweet, and you can see it. So that's kind of where we're going for the future. So there are a lot of stuff in here. I know a lot of people that have used Celestrac for many years. We'll get to talking about something. It's like, oh wow, I didn't know that was on Celestrac, because they're using primarily, they're going in and they're doing something like, oh, I always grab this data file, and it's just a simple text URL, and they load it in their software and do whatever. And it's like, oh well, now there's all these other things that you can use to visualize it or to ask questions about stuff. And I'll give you one more quick example. So we have a slightly different one for active geosynchronous satellites, in that it also gives you the longitude of the ascending node, essentially where the satellite is in the geo belt. And that's important because it turned out I developed this because one of our operators kept saying, hey, my satellite is here and I want to move down here. Tell me which satellites are in between. And it was way harder than it should have been. And so it's like, hey, I could calculate that and put it in a table where you could sort it. And then you can say, oh yeah, here's my satellite and here's where I want to go. And there's all the satellites in between that I have to, there are operators that I have to contact. Or one of the things that we do a lot with geo is, yeah, it's great when they're just sitting where they're supposed to be, but sometimes they move, and sometimes they get moved to the graveyard orbit. And so we have, and you can see the legend at the bottom, but we actually show, when things are drifting. So there's an asterisk if they're drifting more than 1/10 of a degree a day. If it's an up arrow after it, it means it's increasing longitude. Down arrow is decreasing, and then an X is above geo graveyard. So you look at these and say, oh, well, these may all be being decommissioned. They're being moved out of the geo belt, but you can find that really quickly, and you can see, oh, this one started maneuvering, and now it looks like its data is not updating. And you can see, which ones are the oldest. And it turns out that, yeah, one of the ones that's maneuvering apparently hasn't had its orbit updated because they haven't found it since it maneuvered. So there's lots and lots of stuff in here. I would encourage you that if you can't figure it out just by, kind of clicking around or whatever, if you have questions, just shoot me a question. And my email is at the bottom of like every web page. It's like really easy to send me a message.
Well, looking at the visualization tools, we are seeing that there are lots of objects orbiting the Earth. So they are moving at unimaginable speeds, orbital speeds. It is certain that at some point they will collide. So does Celestrac do anything to foresee this kind of events?
Yeah, so when, and I'm leaving the page up because I want to show you a little bit about what we do. So when I was in the Air Force before I retired, I was in charge of analysis for Air Force Space Command. And one of the things that I was responsible for was for things like making sure that we provided analysis support for things like where are objects in Earth orbit. And one of my concerns at the time, so this is back in, started that job in 2001, right after September 11th. And so, the U.S. got involved in operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it turns out that, we ended up using a lot of communications between the U.S. mainland and those theaters. And most of the satellites that we used were commercial. So we're using Intelsat or whoever it happened to be to get communications back and forth. And at the time, the U.S. Air Force was only concerned with screening their satellites for potential collisions. And I think at the time, they might have had 100 satellites. So it wasn't a terribly difficult job. But my concern was like, well, okay, so if you know two military satellites are going to get close to each other, what are you going to do? And it's like, well, we're going to tell both operators, they'll work together, they'll figure out what to do, and then they'll take the action. It's like, great. So if you have one of your satellites getting close to a satellite for one of these commercial guys, what are you going to do? And it's like, oh, we'll tell the military guy and he'll figure out what to do. Now, you notice there wasn't any, we'll contact the commercial guy or we'll tell the commercial guy what we're doing, because they didn't even tell them where the satellite was to start with, right? So if I tell you, hey, we're close to your satellite and we're going to move, then you kind of told them that sort of where your satellite is. And it's like, yeah, that's not really ideal. So you're going to move. And if for some reason the other guy does know where your satellite is and also thinks there's a possibility of colliding and decides to move too, you could actually just move into each other. It's like, okay, that's not good. And then the next question was, and if you have two commercial satellites getting close to each other, what are you going to do? And the answer was, we have no requirement. Basically, we're not going to do anything because we're not required to do anything. And it's like, but you realize 80, I used to use the number 80%. It turned out it was more like 90% of our communications were going over commercial satellites. And it's like, so even though that might be being used for resources for that, that communications channel, and you could lose it, and it would generate debris that could potentially cause the loss of other satellites, you're not going to do anything. And the answer was, it's too hard to do. It would take a supercomputer, millions of dollars, and we couldn't get the data out, quick enough. And so when I retired, even though I was a colonel in the Air Force at the time, it wasn't like I could, prove that they were wrong sitting in a meeting. And so when I retired, it's like, yeah, I'm going to show that that's not true. It doesn't cost millions of dollars. And so we started this program called Satellite Orbital Conjunction Reports Assessing Threatening Encounters in Space. And the acronym is Socrates. And so, when you go in there, it talks about, what we did. Now, this is like from way back. We started this back in 2004, but it talks about what we're doing, what the methodology is, and it's changed since then. We run it 3 times a day, but the basic approach to what we do is all described here. And the idea is that you can go in and you can say, well, show me, the top 10 closest approaches, and you'll notice there's a bunch of them where the min range, that's these numbers, is 0, and it's because I haven't put in Soyuz MS-18 to be ignored, which was just launched yesterday or the day before, so I know what I'm doing when we get off of this call. But so we show which objects and how far apart they are, and then we show some information about what the worst case probability of collision would be. And since these are all docked to the International Space Station, you would kind of expect it might be 100%. And so we actually do see that, but that's not what we're trying to show here. But the important part, I think, here is that we're doing this 3 times a day, and we're looking out a week, so you can see the interval that we're covering. And because when we developed Socrates, we didn't know which satellites were operational. Nobody did, surprisingly. We just used anything that was a payload. So whether it was an active satellite or a dead satellite, we screened that. So we said there's 4,000 active, and there's about 2,700 dead ones. We saw that in the tool. And so that tells us how many primaries, and then everything is what the secondaries are, and we get 46,000 conjunctions. But we do that in hours, And when we first started doing this in 2014, or I'm sorry, 2004, it took like 40 minutes. We were doing it on a desktop computer using, TLEs and using the AGI's SDK software to do it. And so it didn't take a supercomputer. It didn't take hours to do. We had this thing called the internet that you could use to distribute the data to anybody that was interested in it. And we used to have an ability where you could go in and you could click and you could actually build a scenario to see, where they were and kind of view from one satellite to the other what was going on. We're working on integrating that into what we do with the visualization tool. So if we go back for a minute, we go back to the main page and we launch this, the orbit visualization, it turns out that, one of the options here is conjunctions. And so that data that we saw on the table that, might take a little while for you to wrap your head around is all in the conjunction table. So here's all the conjunctions here in the table at the bottom instead of the SATCAD. So if you wanted to know, well, what objects are, have the closest conjunctions, and so we'll ignore all the ones right now for, Soyuz MS-18. But if we go down to like the next one here and we say, oh, well, there's one that's predicted at 10 meters between Cosmos 2506 and a piece of iridium debris. If I click on that entry, it takes me right to that event. And so you can see how it evolves. Now, there can be problems. We'll see if we've got a problem here or not. Nope. Yeah. So you can see if we zoom out far enough, you can see, how far apart. But that's 10 meters. So we're like way, way zoomed in here. We don't have models for the satellite. But so you can sit here and you can say, well, okay, click on that. We'll just actually let me click on a different one. Come back. And you don't want your time span going particularly fast because these things are really flying. But if you animate the scenario, then you can see what's going on. I guess I think I've got something. What is it doing? I think I may have found another bug with the Chrome stuff. But you can see as you animate it, forward or backward, how the event unfolds. You can change your perspective on that, and you can see. But you can go in and you can say, well, sort that. So we'll go back to the current time. But you can sort it on the minimum range. You can sort it on the maximum probability. And so that's the smallest. We want the largest. And you can see it's like, oh, well, the maximum probability case, and that's based on the size of the objects and how far they're apart, is about 2% for today, based on the two-line element set data. And so that was one of the things that we developed early on was, well, we want to be able to show this kind of stuff. And if you had, like we were talking about your satellite, so put enough, that should be enough to sort it. And then you say, okay, I want to see if there's any close approaches for that one. And it's like, oh, well, there actually are. And, so there's 19 over the next week. There's 19 close approaches. Now, some of them aren't, they go all the way out to about 5 kilometers. So they're not particularly close. And even this one, the closest one, is, almost 1.5 kilometers off. But you can see conjunctions between, your satellite and Orbcom, and with debris like from the Chinese ASAT test or the Iridium Cosmos collision. And you can do that fairly simply. And the issue that we have here is the two-line element set data, really the general perturbation data, TLE is the format. but that data was not designed to be particularly accurate to be able to discern things like whether it's 10 meters or 100 meters or 1,000 meters, really. It was more intended, if I see a satellite going over this sensor and I propagate it to where it should be over the next sensor, I can tell it's the same satellite, and I can collect the obs and associate it with that track and update the orbit. And it doesn't have to be accurate to 10 meters or 100 meters. It can be much less accurate and still provide the information that you need. And so it doesn't really work well for this kind of stuff. So we get general statistics. I mean, if you're seeing events like this and you use better data, they're probably still going to be close, depending on how you want to define close. But it might be 500 meters, it might be 3 kilometers, who knows? But that's, the whole idea with Socrates initially was we want to get something out there that shows people that this happens a lot. Because back when we started doing this in 2004, and you may still get the impression, when you see stuff in the news that, oh yeah, satellites getting close to other satellites is a rare thing. It is not. It literally happens thousands of times every day. And the only reason that, we don't see lots of collisions is because the probability of a collision is still pretty small. So even these maximum, you see the first one you have, you got like 2 chances in a million that these two objects, because this one's, pretty small, right? That these two objects are actually going to hit at this predicted distance. And so if you think about it, it's like, well, okay, so I probably am not going to lose any sleep over, a chance on a million that something might happen. But, if it happened a million times, that sort of is suggesting that eventually it's going to, you're going to have a collision. And that's what we're trying to get people to understand is like, it happens a lot. Yes, it's a low probability, but it's just like the lottery. So I'm not going to win the lottery. You're probably not going to win the lottery. Somebody's going to win the lottery. And, in this case, you're not winning, you're losing. I mean, you can't necessarily predict that conjunction we saw at 10 meters is going to actually be a collision. But, you could reasonably predict that satellites are going to collide. And we saw that, with the Iridium Cosmos stuff, back in the, don't want to do that. Maybe I'll just, there we go. And so we saw that back in the Iridium Cosmos case where you had 2 satellites that nobody was really screening because it's just like, well, this, the data is not good enough. We can't, reasonably predict it. And then just by chance, they collided. And that's really because we have done that experiment millions and millions of times. And it was just a matter of time that somebody was going to actually win or lose.
Okay. So we are slowly reaching our time limit. I'm going to ask my final question and then have some questions from the chat box. Then we will conclude our webinar tonight. So my final question is going to be, as a professional who has been tracking satellites for more than 35 years, how do you evaluate the rate of change in the number of human-made objects in the low Earth orbit?
Yeah, this is a big concern, right? So, I mentioned that initially we had issues with trying to determine what satellites were operational, but we have a pretty good idea of that number, and it's up to 4,000. So if you go back, even just a couple of years ago, it was only a little over 1,000. And of course, part of that is, well, SpaceX has launched over 1,300 satellites now. So they've launched more than we had for quite a while. And we've got a lot of other, Cubesats and stuff like that. And you might think, wow, that's pretty big. We've doubled or maybe even quadrupled the number of active satellites up there. and you saw what the numbers. I am sharing. Okay. So if we go back here and we look at, just show you real quick, in the satellite catalog, there's a box score. So it shows, everything that's been launched, how many we think are active. And when you get down to the bottom of the page, then you see, well, here's the totals. So we can see, we said we have 4,000 active. You can see, so you can kind of do the math there, right? So we have 7,000 payloads on orbit and 4,000 are active. So, you've got about 3,000 that are dead. See how many decayed and all that. But you can see how these numbers are growing over time. And so you can see things like there's when the Chinese ASAT happened and we had this slow growth in the catalog as it was cataloged. Then you have the Iridium Cosmos, and that took a while to catalog. And you're going along and the slope is reasonably constant. But you can see that right about here, so the end of 2019, it's really starting to ramp up. And you think, well, okay, that's in the catalog. A bunch of stuff must be decaying, right? Well, that's what this red curve is. And you can see that's pretty flat. That has not changed probably since 1990. It's, this constant rate of things coming out of orbit. But you can see the same, growth where it's going up. And if you look at, and I'll send you a link for the video that we put together, but we talk about the growth. There are actually applications right now for on the order of 100,000 objects being launched into Earth orbit in the next 10 years. So, when you think about it, all the things that we're showing and we're trying to make it easier to understand, a large part of that is because things are changing and not a lot of people seem to realize, they see Starlink. Starlink's pretty obvious, right? But they're not seeing how dramatically the pattern is changing from the past. And we're not going to have a lot of time. Now, are all 100,000 of those satellites going to launch? No. A lot of those companies are probably going to go bankrupt, but the main ones, like Starlink and OneWeb and Kuiper, that's probably still about 70,000 satellites. And so everything that we're talking about, like how do you track it, how do you stay, keep from running into it, is going to become increasingly more difficult. So what I think is important for you to take away is that we have ways to do this. We're constantly looking for better ways to do this. But if you're looking for something to do after you finish your education, there's going to be lots of opportunities. The fact that I did what I did over the last 35 years does not mean by any stretch of the imagination we've done everything we need to do with tracking satellites. Because you have more satellites, more observations, more difficulty in associating observations with actual objects, more difficulty in predicting accurately and informing operators what to do. And so it's important to be aware of these changes that are coming and the changes that have to be supported in, like the software and the formats and all that kind of stuff, which we're already doing.
So we can, there are some great questions in our chat box. We can continue with having them and asking.
Well, I'm looking at the wrong tab.
I can just read. They're on the screen right now. Sarham Demir asked that, what do you think about traffic management in space after Starlink, OneWeb, or other clusters are operating? Do you expect any regulations will be discussed under the United Nations?
To be honest, that process takes way too long. And you could, when you look at that graph and you can see, things starting to go up noticeably, you realize that any regulation or laws or whatever are way behind the time. And so and this happens in a lot of new technologies, right? The technology takes off and it starts, having an effect on society, and then people go, "Oh my God, we should do something," and it's usually too late. And so, what we're trying to do, and so I work very closely with Starlink, with the Starlink team at SpaceX. I work closely with the OneWeb guys. I'm trying to encourage them to be more responsible about this. You may have seen the stuff with Starlink and the effect on astronomy. We don't get a lot of mention on it, and that's fine. But we were doing a lot of the work behind the scenes to help people understand what the issue was. And it was because SpaceX came to me and said, "Hey, we need to, the data we're getting from," and again, this isn't the Space Force guys' fault, but the data we're getting from them isn't really accurate to the level that we need to be, because we're doing low thrust maneuvering on our satellites all the time. And so if it takes days to catch up on maneuvers, then you're never going to really know where the satellite is. And so it's like, well, we do supplemental data. We can be predicting where you're going to be in the next day or so, and then people can use that. And so the astronomers did that, right? So they went out and they said, well, you launched this dark sat, and we're trying to see whether it's brighter or dimmer than the other ones. Well, if you're tracking the wrong satellite, you're not going to get good results out of that. And so SpaceX got that. We work with the astronomers, they got that. But there's all sorts of implications. There's the visual stuff for astronomy. There's all sorts of radio interference kinds of things. And honestly, if we wait for the UN or really anybody else, like the UN would seem to be logical, right? Because then it might apply to everybody. But if it's going to be, well, the US does it and Turkey does it and Europe does it, and they all have different approaches, and then people go, oh, but Russia doesn't do it, so I'm going to go launch my stuff out of Russia and I don't have to follow your rules. We've got to get the community as a whole to understand the problem and to work together, because it's really in their interest. And if you've looked at any regulation, whether it's satellites or airplanes or shipping or whatever, what you find out is if that industry has a problem and they wait for it to be bad enough for some government to realize it's a problem, they're probably going to get regulations they don't like, right? Because it's hard to understand some of these things. So if you know what you have to do to avoid a collision, and then you get somebody in a legislative body somewhere, the UN, the US, wherever, and they don't understand it, and they go, oh, well, you should do this. And it's like, no, that's just going to make my job harder. You should have been out in front of it, doing it on your own and working with the people that you're interacting with. So that's a lot of what we're doing right now is we educate. So the stuff I was showing you, like with the visualization, part of that is to educate the people that might want to make regulations so they can understand the magnitude of the problem. And, I can't tell them what to do, and they might not listen to me even if I did, but I can help them understand that, oh yeah, the stuff you're hearing over here about it is a problem or it's the end of the world kind of problem, that's not what's going on. This is what's going on. Make your decisions based on, objective fact. And I realize your values and my values will be different. I'll try to convince you that maybe there's reasons to change that, but we've got those people working, and we've got a lot of the operators. So the Space Data Center is not regulated by any government. It is 30 plus countries and 30 plus operators that have come together, and it includes NASA and NOAA and EUMETSAT, and it's military, it's civilian, it's commercial, and they're all working together because it's like, wow, we can't really afford to run into each other in orbit, and nobody else is helping us, so we're just going to do it on our own. And it's a good example of what I think we can do going forward. But I'm not, if you're familiar with the process they go through in the UN, it takes many, many years to implement something like that. And we don't have many, many years.
So could we say that the only group of people who are actively fighting against this are astronomers, ranging on Twitter about stalling satellites?
I think the astronomy community has probably been more effective in organizing, their concerns. I think it'd probably be naive to assume that nobody else has a problem with any of this. But the problem is if it's just you that has a problem, and you may know something that, or have figured out something that nobody else realizes yet, if you're not effectively bringing others together to understand what that is, and then you're communicating it in some consistent way, you're probably not going to get any attention on it. So the astronomers were very quick to come out, because if you have not seen a Starlink pass, they're pretty amazing. I mean, if you discount all the other stuff, right? The first one that we did, so working with SpaceX, we were able to get data so that we could generate supplemental TLEs for the launch like a week before the data went out on Space Force. So we were able to do that kind of stuff. And the day after the first launch, I remember going out in the yard to watch, and it wasn't quite dark enough, and there was like a thin haze of clouds. And all of a sudden, you just see like all these dots just moving along together. It's like, oh my God. And immediately you knew, because normally you can't see a satellite until the sky is pretty dark, except for maybe the space station. And so immediately, because I do a lot of astronomy stuff, you knew astronomers, that was going to get their attention. And so they organized, through their society and everything, and communicated the problem. Whether there's other ones out there, I would assume there probably are, and they just are not being effective in communicating their concerns of what's going on.
I see. The next question from Barış Gencay. Mr. Kelso, how do you see AI participation to Sgp4 calculation in today's congested constellation space and decision-making process in maneuver calculation in 5 years of time?
So there's some really interesting aspects to that. So you realize, when you look at, like we were talking about 46,000 conjunctions in a week, right? And you realize, wow, that's for a human being to go through and try to make sense of it, that's going to be pretty hard to do. And so if the number of satellites doubles, the number of conjunctions is probably going to go up by a square to a third, right? I mean, if you're, depending on the orbital regime and everything, it's going to be a lot. And so having some way to better understand it, now whether it's using Sgp4 or not, probably isn't particularly relevant to what we're going. But you have to have some way to propagate it and to be able to assess the uncertainty and to make decisions. And it has to be what I've been trying for years now to get people to do is, it's like, well, you really can't do it on how close, because like, think about when you're driving your car. If you're driving down the highway and somebody is driving next to you, your uncertainty in this direction, right, is not really that high. It's like, oh, I'm going to stay in my lane, he's going to stay in his lane, we're okay. Now, when you're driving behind him and he could touch his brakes or whatever with little to no notice, if you get too close, you realize, oh, my uncertainty is like a lot higher here. Maybe I need to be further separation. So using distance as a metric really isn't good. And so a lot of people want to use probability. And it's like, well, but the probability of me hitting a rock, let's say, a rock that happens to roll across the road, might be the same as me hitting a tractor trailer, but I'm thinking I'd rather hit the rock than the tractor trailer rig, right? And so, we have to filter all that into this kind of AI process. Unfortunately, we have operators today, and Starlink is one of them, where they think they have enough information to just provide the data to the satellite and let the satellite figure out what it's going to do. And so if you're working AI, you know that even though it has a lot of powerful capabilities, it also has its own uncertainty that we don't necessarily know what it's going to do. And so, you train it on a lot of stuff and you think it's like, just like for those of you that have kids, you teach them like, well, this is what you're supposed to do, what you're not supposed to do. And then they do stuff that is like, where did you come up with that? And so you're going to find the same kind of thing with AI. I mean, and particularly, and there's issues there too, right? Because, just like being a parent, you think you know what the right thing to do is, and maybe you don't. And we see a lot of that. Like we've had people suggest for AI that, well, we'll sit down with cases that we've had in the past, and we'll use that to train the AI for what to do in the future. And it's like, no, that's not a good idea, because a lot of times what really happens is somebody looks at the data and they either don't properly assess the data, or some of the data is wrong, and they make a decision, and then there's no collision, and it's like, oh, we made the right decision. It's like, remember, you had a 1 in a million chance to start with. So I'm thinking I could have like gone and had a cup of coffee and done just as well as whatever it was that you did. And so the AI stuff is going to be important, but there are a lot of questions about the data going into it, and how do you train it, and how do you prevent having biases based on what people think is going on with an event. I think it will happen, and it's going to, when you get tens of thousands of satellites in similar orbits, it's going to happen, because if it doesn't, the first time you have a satellite all of a sudden die in an operational orbit, and now it's affecting, everybody else in that orbit, because it's going to eventually drift along that orbit, right? And then they've got to dodge, and then, well, what happens if I dodge and I get too close to something in another orbit when we cross? I mean, people are not going to be able to wrap their heads around what to do well enough without some kind of significant change in how we approach it. And AI probably is a solution, but there'll be a lot of work to get there.
The next question is coming from Kayurma100. In your opinion, what method of active removal of space debris yields the greatest feasibility in near-time future?
Yeah, I think I'm looking forward to, that ELSA date is launched, and they're going to be doing some experiments there. I'm really looking forward to seeing what happens there, because a lot of the approaches to date have been limited to, let's say, a very simplified circumstance. Like, I'm sitting next to the satellite, so I'm here, here's a satellite, and I'm gonna throw a net at it, or I'm gonna shoot a harpoon into it, or whatever. And it's like, yeah, that's not very realistic, because if you're doing that, you're probably doing it with a satellite that's not working. Satellites not working don't tend to be stable. You got the whole attitude, the whole issue of, how do I get to, things like, how do I rendezvous? That's a non-trivial task. How do I do proximity operations with it? Like, how do I move around it and not run into it? Just make the problem worse. So I'm not sure I know what the best solution is, but I think we need to get to the point where we understand more about kind of a big picture approach, right? And so one of the concerns that a lot of the people I work with have is, we can move satellites, active satellites, to avoid a collision, but I showed you there's 2,000 rocket bodies up there, and those can't move, and they're big, and And if they hit something, they're going to generate lots of debris and then have, cascading impact. And so you sit there and you go, oh, well, so I'm going to go up and take out a rocket body. And presumably you're not going to do that with a net or a harpoon or something. And so the technique or whatever in terms of feasibility is really going to depend on what the object is. And so you sit there and say, well, okay, I'm going to dock with this thing that has no docking adapter and it's probably tumbling. How do I do this in a way to get rid of this object and then somehow stabilize it and then maneuver it presumably down the atmosphere so it re-enters? And all that takes fuel, and it's like, well, so you're going to do it once. It's probably going to cost you more to do it once than it did to put the thing up in the first place. And so there's the technical side of what might work, but you really need a system kind of system engineering approach to it that says, well, what are the ones that you should prioritize? What kinds of techniques work for those, as opposed to, like, if I go up and grab Cubesat, it's probably reasonably easy, right? Even if it's tumbling. And so you're gonna have different technologies for that. And then the whole thing about how much fuel do I need? How do I make it cost effective? I guess honestly, I don't know the answer to that question. I root for the guys doing active debris removal because they would make my job a lot easier if they could be successful. It's not as easy as a lot of the news articles that you see talking about it seem to make people think.
I see. The rest of the questions are in the chat box are really great, but sadly we have reached our time constraint. So thank you for joining us tonight. Before ending our session, I would like to thank Gümüş Aerospace, a company from Turkey, providing a wide array of services in terms of Cubesats, for sponsoring our streaming platform. They also, as a satellite operator, want to thank you, Dr. Kelso, for making all the data accessible and open to public. And most importantly, we want to thank you for joining us tonight and answering all of our questions in detail.
I'm glad to have had the opportunity. I think it's important from an education perspective to get more people to understand this. And I just want to, when I told you the story about like how I got started, just realize if you have the curiosity and you go out and work on the education side of things, to feed that curiosity, you can do a lot and have a similar impact on the community. And so I would certainly encourage any of you that have questions about things that you're interested in, feel free to send me an email. I'll be happy to help out. So thanks for the opportunity.
Well, we thank you. Good night then.
All right. Aloha.